In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Genesis 1:1, King James Version. Is this the best way to translate the opening clause of Genesis? It's certainly how the vast majority of English translations have done it since Wycliffe's translation back in the 14th century. Well, okay, Wycliffe's translation is a bit different, but with the exception of spelling, the first three words, in the beginning, are exactly the same, which is our main focus in this episode anyway. This way of translating the beginning of Genesis has definitely become standard. But, of course, the fact that something is standard doesn't mean it's correct. A few more recent translations render the verse differently, saying something like, "When God began to create heaven and earth." To my knowledge, this first showed up in Tanakh, the Holy Scriptures, published by Jewish Publication Society in 1985. But it's also the wording used by Robert Alter in his translation, The Hebrew Bible, a Translation with Commentary, which has been considered by some to be the most significant translation of the Hebrew Bible since the King James Version. Obviously, there's no one correct way to translate, and it's extremely difficult and often impossible to capture all the nuances of a text in a translation. Thankfully, we aren't stuck with only one translation. And when translations differ on a phrase, it doesn't mean that one is entirely right and the other entirely wrong. Differing translations sometimes each capture something in the text that other translations miss, while simultaneously missing something that others capture. But to be clear, this also doesn't mean that we can just combine every nuance from every translation and think we better understand the text. The only way to really measure to what extent a translation is accurate is to compare it to the original. Furthermore, comparison to the original is also the only way to know which nuances accurately reflect the text when we have discrepancies in the meaning of different translations. Take the two main translations we're looking at. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. That's how it reads in the KJV, and most other translations are pretty close to it. Now, for the other translation, when God began to create heaven and earth. Again, this is found in JPS 1985 and Robert Alter's translation. Focusing on the first phrase, what's the difference in meaning here? There are actually several differences. First, in the beginning is commonly interpreted as though we have a particular and definite point of time being referenced. That is, the beginning, in a cosmic sense. And the verse then seems to be saying that in that cosmic beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. On the other hand, the translation, when God began to create heaven and earth, conveys something quite different. The time being referred to is tethered to an event, the creation of heaven and earth. The word began here is used to refer to the beginning of that event, the beginning of the process of creating heaven and earth. As is probably becoming quite obvious, these two translations convey two very different ideas regarding the beginning. One speaks of the beginning as a distinct period of time that can be referred to merely by saying the beginning. The other translation lacks this notion entirely, but communicates the idea that it's the beginning of something. Another way to understand this nuance is to take note of the fact that in the KJV type translation, the creation of the heaven and the earth is something that takes place within a larger period known as the beginning, while in the JPS and Robert Alter translations, it's just the reverse. The beginning is the initial slice of time within the process of God creating heaven and earth. There are other differences as well, such as the fact that in most translations, following the KJV, Genesis 1:1 is a complete sentence in itself, while in the alternative translation, Genesis 1:1 is just the beginning of a sentence that continues on into the next verse. Listen again. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. See? A complete sentence. Compare that with this. When God began to create heaven and earth. As you can see, this is not a complete sentence. And obviously, you'd have to read the following verses to know what it was like when God began to create heaven and earth. There's so much more to say just about this verse, like whether the word translated create really means create in how we usually think of it. But we'll have to save that for future episodes. For now, we're going to keep focused on the first phrase. So, with these two very different translations in mind, we have to ask, what is the Hebrew text of Genesis 1:1 describing? Is it talking about a definite period of time called the beginning, in which God created the heaven and the earth? Or is it talking about the time when God began to create heaven and earth? Well, as we've already said, the only way to really know which is the more accurate nuance is to look at the Hebrew. So, let's look at the Hebrew. And don't worry, you don't need to understand Hebrew to get the points I'm about to make. I'll do my best to communicate the issues so that you can understand it as fully as possible in English. With that said, here's Genesis 1:1 in Hebrew. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. The first word here is bereshit. The be part at the beginning is a common prefix that usually means in or when, among other things. The basic meaning of reshit is beginning, but in Hebrew it's clear that this word is in a construct state. What does that mean? It means that it's describing the beginning of something, rather than simply being the beginning, full stop. This is really important to know, since just this little piece of information helps to sort out which translation more accurately conveys the Hebrew. And clearly, this aspect of the Hebrew is more clearly captured by the JPS and Robert Alter translations. But of course, this is just the beginning. Or should I say, the beginning of understanding the issue. But again, even this one little fact, the fact that Bereshit means in the beginning of something, helps to make the answer to a couple of other questions pretty obvious. For example, if Bereshit means in the beginning of something, we then have to ask, what is the something? Thankfully, the context makes that pretty obvious. It's the beginning of God creating the heavens and the earth. Again, we'll deal with the translation of some of these other words in future podcasts, but for now we'll just use the words from common translations. This also helps to answer the question of whether Genesis 1:1 is a complete sentence in itself, or whether it's just the first clause of a sentence that continues into the next verse. And when you read the first few verses of Genesis 1 with the construct state of Bereshit in mind, the answer actually becomes pretty obvious. Genesis 1:1 is not a complete sentence. Again, for a word to be in a construct state basically means that it's something of something else. For example, if I wanted to talk about male horses, I would say susim. That's just the masculine plural form of the word for horse, sus. But let's say I wanted to refer to the male horses of Israel. I wouldn't just say susim Yisrael. I would actually have to change the word for plural male horses into a construct state. It would be susei Yisrael. That's horses of Israel. It has that of element, and so the construct state lets you know that it's something of something else. So again, Bereshit is in a construct state, and so that means it's talking about the beginning of something. So now I'm going to read Genesis 1:1 again with this construct state actually present in the translation, and it'll be pretty obvious that this can't be a complete sentence. In the beginning of God creating the heaven and the earth. Okay, well, obviously the sentence must go on, right? In the beginning of God creating the heaven and the earth, what? The what is actually what's found in the following verses. To illustrate the relationship between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, here's Genesis 1:1-3 in Robert Alter's translation. When God began to create heaven and earth, and the earth then was welter and waste, and darkness over the deep, and God's breath hovering over the waters, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. As I said earlier, there's certainly more to consider here, even when translating just the first Hebrew word of Genesis, Bereshit. But this episode is already long enough. In a future episode, we'll talk some more about the fact that Bereshit is speaking of the beginning of something rather than referring to the beginning. But just knowing that this is the case will hopefully help you to understand Genesis 1 a bit more clearly than you did before listening to this episode. If you're enjoying what you're learning in this podcast, and if you know anyone else who you think might enjoy it, please tell them. Thanks, and talk to you next time.